And he says this, more sure. There's a whole theology in those two words. More sure. Before I even go into that, let's just step back again and think of this guy, Peter. He's starting by saying, yeah, I was an eyewitness. And he almost dismisses it in this passage because that's not the big deal. But think of what he was an eyewitness to. This guy heard the voice of God more than once. He heard it at the baptism. He heard it on the Mount of Transfiguration. He saw Jesus become as radiant as the sun. He saw the appearing of the great Jewish patriarchs, Elijah and Moses, showing up and talking with Jesus. And then a brilliant cloud came, and he was so scared he fell on his face. And the first thing he had to do when he got down from that mountain, this thing was so terrible and awesome in its beauty, he had to change his underwear. They leave that out of the passage. But you get the idea. He was terrified. It was so beautiful. What an amazing thing. God surrounded them. He was there locked in that upper room when Thomas, who didn't believe, got to stick his finger in the side of the risen Christ. He saw all this stuff. He was there. He felt it. He was a witness to this. Can you imagine yourself? How strong would your faith be if you were through all of that? How strong would your faith be? And he almost dismisses it and says, but more sure are the scriptures, is what he's saying. He had more sure. I thought, wow, does this word really mean when it was originally said? This is pivotal to the entire passage. This more sure is so important. What was actually going through their head when they wrote that in the original Greek? What was going on? And bebaos was the word, and it means this, through the idea of basality. In other words, this is the basis of everything I say. This is the bedrock on which it stands. This is the anchor. This is the reason. This is the credibility to everything else I say is this. So he is saying Scripture is the big bebaos in all of this. Scripture is not what I saw. Scripture. That is the more sure in all of this, even above his own eyes. Doesn't that sound like backwards? You mean reading about it is more than personal experience? Yeah. This is from the guy who heard God directly. Yes, Scripture is. And you just have to kind of step back and go, well, why? You mean Scripture even over a young kid coming back and telling you face to face, this is what I saw? Yeah. And it leaves you asking why? Why? How can it be that what I read is more important? Well, let's look through. What I want to do is just simply kind of rapid fire hit you with a few reasons why that is actually true. And it starts with this. Scripture is inspired. Scripture is inspired. Right there, if we are not at a point of accepting this, nothing else matters. You can read the most involved critique and literary criticism on Scripture, but if you start from the premise it's not inspired, all it is some good writing. We have to start with a couple of really basic things. One is there is a God, that there is a God. And I guess only God can convince us that there is a God. That's where it starts. But then the second thing is that this God cares so much that he actually talks to and through people. That he actually talks to and through people. And that's the whole basis of inspiration. It means that these people talked in obedience. We catch their personality. You can, oh man, the studies are just amazing. It's beautiful. You can catch the personality of people as you read through Scripture. You read something written by Peter, he doesn't sound like Paul. And you read the stuff of Jesus, he sounds different than Peter or Paul. And this type of thing. It's beautiful how their personalities, and yet it doesn't change the truth of what they're writing. As a matter of fact, in much of Scripture, when they were writing, they didn't even understand what they were writing. It wasn't made totally clear to them. Did they know that? Yes, they did. Isaiah, one of the greatest prophets, the greatest of the greatest, major of the major prophets. In Isaiah the book, 59, verse 11, he says this, we all, it starts with the words we all, as in that's not the southern thing, it's not the y'all, it's the we all. It's saying all-inclusive, including himself. We all growl like bears and moan sadly like doves. We look for justice, but there is none. For salvation, but it is far from us. But salvation, and it is far from us. The Old Testament folks had an idea of salvation, and he is saying, even from me, it is far from me. It is far from us. Salvation, far from understood. And yet in verse 53, he explains salvation, as we look in hindsight, to a T. It's called the Messianic chapter of 53. It is where he explains to a T how, the mode, the motive, how it will come down, when and why the Messiah will die, and how that will affect things. And God gave him these words to write down, and yet what happens with the Messiah 7 centuries after he's laid in the ground? Can you imagine if God spoke something to you in here today, but the whole thing wouldn't come true, the whole thing wouldn't happen for another 7 centuries? We won't, it's hard to, we can't even visualize what the world will be like in 7 centuries, if there even will be one. But can you imagine? And the ancient Jews had a very practical system. They had a very practical test for whether somebody was a true prophet or not. And it was simply this: what you said would come true. What would happen, it would actually come into reality. So it took 7 centuries, but everything happened exactly as Isaiah wrote in that chapter 53. The Messiah's situation came down exactly like that. So Scripture is proven and etched in human history. It's there. It's there to be seen. It's very hard to refute that there is truth to Scripture. And I think it's divinely shown to us that it is inspired, but we have to start there. But if Scripture is inspired, that sets up a whole bunch of implications. If Scripture is inspired, for example, if Scripture is inspired, it is timeless. It is timeless. Scripture is proven in time and endures all time. Scripture is timeless. There is a time when Scripture is fulfilled, but it never becomes obsolete. Scripture is fulfilled, but never becomes obsolete. Since the Garden of Eden, evil is still wrong, and obedience to the designer of it all is still good. Murder is still bad. Kindness is still good. The result of sin is still death. The 10 Commandments were written on stone. They may have been fulfilled, and they may have been fulfilled by one commandment, which the one commandment we are called to follow now is not written on stone, but on our hearts, which is love. However, even if you go back and you look at love in motion in the day-to-day life, do you know what it looks like? The 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments will happen naturally because love is written on the heart. Fulfilled but never obsolete. What was wrong then, what has been wrong in the beginning is still wrong today. And what was good in the beginning is still good today. It's timeless. It hasn't changed. We may change our moral structure in our society, and pop culture may tell us things, but good is still good and bad is still bad. Scripture empowers you with certain qualities as it becomes part of who you are, as it becomes part of what you're working with. Things like what? Wisdom. You pull a wisdom that you're not going to get from the world. Purpose. You start seeing why you are here on this earth. You start seeing a bigger picture. And of course, eternal hope. Eternal hope is woven through the whole thing. The qualities are the real sign of a spiritual life. Maybe it's time for it to be fresh again. Maybe it's the time to make moves even to make it fresh, because this what shows us if we are real in our spiritual walk. It doesn't mean anything just to believe it or even to read it a little. It has to be lived. It's the more sure, the bedrock of life. So if it's real, it becomes real in us. Then we're not asking ourselves, the question doesn't become, is heaven for real? It becomes, are you for real? Heaven will take care of itself, the reality of heaven. But are we for real?